The floodwaters roared like an angry beast through the dark streets of New Orleans, swallowing cars, tearing down fences, and pulling everything in its way. In the middle of this chaos, a black luxury sedan stood trapped, half submerged, its headlights flickering like fading fireflies. Inside, Richard Anderson, a man known across Texas and Louisiana for his hotels, his money, and his pride, leaned against the glass with tears in his eyes. "Just let me die," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken, and defeated. "My life doesn't make sense anymore. There's nothing left for me." Out of the shadows of the rushing water came Emily Carter, her uniform torn, covered in mud, and her apron clinging to her skin. She had no reason to stop. She had her own problems, her own son waiting at home, and barely enough money to buy food for the week. But something in Richard's voice, in the raw pain that cut through the storm, struck her like lightning. She rushed toward the car, fighting the current, her hands bleeding from debris, scraping her skin. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice trembling yet fierce. "You are not going to die here tonight." Richard shook his head inside the car, water already rising past his chest. His hand pressed against the glass, as if to beg her to leave. "You don't understand," he cried, choking on the floodwaters. "I lost everything that mattered. Just let me go." His words echoed like a confession, like a man surrendering not just to the storm, but to the weight of a grief no fortune could erase. Emily slammed her fists against the door handle, determined, refusing to let his despair drown him. Finally, with a cry of effort, Emily forced the door open, and the water surged in, nearly pulling both of them under. She grabbed his arm, her thin frame trembling against the force of the current. Richard resisted at first, pushing her away, but when another wave slammed against the car, he gasped, clinging to her like a drowning child. She pulled him with everything she had, dragging him out into the violent water. "Come on!" she yelled through the storm. "Don't you dare give up now." As Emily struggled to pull Richard toward higher ground, the storm raged around them, lightning flashing, thunder cracking as if heaven itself was watching. And in that moment, two lives, one broken by grief, the other weighed down by poverty, collided in a way neither could ever have predicted. But what Emily didn't know was that saving this man would not only change his life, it would completely transform her own. Before we go deeper into this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I promise the journey ahead will leave you speechless. Before the storm that almost swallowed him whole, Richard Anderson was a man of shining suits and golden opportunities. He owned a chain of luxury hotels, stretching from Houston to Miami. His name whispered in boardrooms and splashed across business magazines. Yet behind every deal and headline was a man growing colder, lonelier, and emptier with each passing year. He had lost his wife to illness, distanced himself from his only daughter, and drowned his nights in expensive whiskey. To the outside world, Richard was untouchable. Inside, he was a hollow shell with a fortune that couldn't buy peace. Emily Carter's world could not have been more different. She was a single mother working 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and taking shifts at a small diner in the evenings, just to keep the lights on in her modest apartment in Houston. Her son, Tyler, was her pride, her reason to wake up each morning, even when her body screamed for rest. She wore hand-me-down uniforms and shoes with soles worn thin, but she carried herself with quiet strength. To her employers, she was invisible, another maid blending into the background. To Tyler, she was a hero. Their paths crossed only once before the storm, in the gleaming lobby of one of Richard's hotels. Emily had been part of a cleaning crew, hired for a corporate event. She remembered how he walked past her without even noticing, his eyes fixed on his phone, his mind locked in deals worth millions. She had looked at him then and thought, that man must have everything. If only she knew the truth. The flood changed everything. As Emily dragged Richard through the raging waters, flashes of her son's face pushed her forward. She thought of Tyler's smile, his laughter, and his small hands that clung to hers at night. She knew if it were him trapped in that car, she'd want someone, anyone, to save him. That thought gave her the strength of 10 men as she fought against the current. Richard, shivering and gasping, began to see her not as just a maid, but as a force of pure will. By the time they reached a patch of higher ground, a church staircase barely above the waterline, both collapsed, drenched and trembling. Richard coughed violently, clutching his chest, while Emily leaned back against the stone steps, her breath ragged. For a long moment neither spoke. The storm howled above, but in that silence between them, a fragile bond had been forged, and neither of them realized that this night would bind their lives together in ways they could never undo. But what happened inside that small church shelter would open wounds neither of them were ready to face. Inside the dimly lit church shelter, dozens of families huddled together, their clothes soaked, their faces pale from fear. The air smelled of damp wood and wet fabric, with candles flickering weakly against the shadows. Emily guided Richard toward a corner bench, her arms trembling from exhaustion. He sat heavily, his suit clinging to his body like a second skin, water dripping onto the old wooden floor. For a man who once sat in penthouses overlooking city skylines, this place was a prison of humility. Emily, her apron torn and streaked with mud, wrung out her sleeves and glanced around the room. Mothers whispered prayers while cradling their children, and old men muttered about lost homes. She spotted a young boy who reminded her of Tyler, and her chest tightened. She thought of him safe at home with her neighbor, and silently thanked God she wasn't mourning him tonight. Richard noticed her eyes soften as she watched the child, and for the first time he saw something beyond her mud-stained uniform. He saw compassion that money couldn't buy. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse and low. "You should have left me," he muttered. "You don't know what kind of man you saved." "I'm not worth it." Emily turned to him sharply, her brown eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you ever say that? No one deserves to drown alone in the dark. Not even you." Her words cut through him, sharper than any deal gone wrong or headline criticizing his empire. He looked away, ashamed, unable to meet her gaze. Minutes stretched into an hour as the rain hammered the roof. Slowly Richard began to talk, halting at first, then with a flood of bitterness and grief. He spoke of his wife, how cancer had taken her in less than a year, leaving him with nothing but an empty mansion. He confessed he hadn't spoken to his daughter in almost 3 years, after a fight that pushed her away to another state. "I built hotels all across the country," he said, his eyes glistening, "but I couldn't even keep my own family together." His voice cracked, and for a moment, the mighty millionaire looked like a lost child. Emily listened quietly, her hands folded tightly on her lap. When he finished, she took a deep breath and shared her own story, how her husband had walked out when Tyler was only 2, how she'd cleaned houses ever since, how she'd missed school plays because she was working late to pay for food. Her voice wavered, but there was pride beneath the pain. "I may not have much," she said firmly, "but my son knows I'd fight the world for him. That's what keeps me going." And in that broken church, surrounded by strangers, the maid and the millionaire discovered they weren't as different as they thought. But what came next would test them both in ways they never imagined. By morning the storm had calmed, leaving behind streets that looked more like rivers than roads. The National Guard arrived, pulling families out of flooded homes and guiding survivors toward buses headed to shelters in Baton Rouge. Emily and Richard stepped outside the church, blinking against the grey light of dawn. Reporters were everywhere, snapping photos and shoving microphones into the faces of those who had made it through the night. When one reporter spotted Richard dripping wet beside a maid with mud on her face, the cameras swarmed like bees to honey. Richard Anderson, the hotel tycoon, rescued by a maid. The headline blared the next day. The story spread like wildfire across social media. Photos of Emily dragging Richard through the water painted a picture that the world couldn't ignore. Some mocked him for being powerless without his money, others praised Emily as a hero. Strangers debated online whether it was fate, irony, or divine justice that a billionaire owed his life to a woman who scrubbed floors for a living. For Richard, it was humiliation, yet also the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. At first, he avoided Emily, too embarrassed to face the reminder of his weakness. He boarded a private car arranged by his company, while she rode a bus back to Houston, with nothing but the soaked clothes on her back. But as he sat in silence, watching the city roll past through tinted glass, he saw her face in his mind, her determination, her anger when he told her to let him die, the quiet strength in her voice as she spoke of her son. It gnawed at him. For the first time in years, he wanted to know more about someone else's story. Meanwhile, Emily returned to her small apartment to find Tyler safe, waiting with questions about the storm. She hugged him tightly, promising everything would be okay, even as she wondered how she'd replace the ruined clothes and pay the bills piling on the kitchen counter. She didn't expect her phone to buzz with messages from neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers. "Is this you in the news?" Her photo, alongside Richard's, was everywhere. Emily tried to laugh it off, but deep down, fear mixed with pride, fear of unwanted attention, pride that maybe for once she wasn't invisible. That night, Richard sat in his mansion, staring at the photo of Emily on his tablet. For years, he had been surrounded by people who only cared for his wealth, yet here was a woman who risked her life for him without hesitation, without asking for a single dollar. "Why?" he muttered to himself, running a hand over his tired face. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, a question he couldn't shake. And that question would soon lead him back to her doorstep. But when Richard showed up at Emily's door, what he asked her would leave her completely speechless. 2 weeks later, life had almost returned to normal for Emily, or at least as normal as it could be. She was back scrubbing floors at the Johnsons' estate, wearing a borrowed uniform from a friend. The storm was fading into memory, but whispers still followed her. Neighbors called her the Maid who saved a millionaire, and some even treated her with a respect she wasn't used to. Emily shrugged it off. Praise didn't pay rent. She kept her head down, focusing on Tyler, who had been asking endless questions about why she was on TV. One Friday morning, as Emily pushed her cart down the marble hall of the Johnsons' home, she nearly dropped her mop when she saw him, Richard Anderson, standing in the foyer in a tailored grey suit. He looked out of place, awkward even, like a man who had wandered into the wrong world. Emily froze. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Richard cleared his throat. "I came to see you. I owe you my life, Emily, and I can't pretend like nothing happened." Her first instinct was to laugh bitterly. "You don't owe me anything," she said, gripping the mop handle tightly. "I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Richard nodded, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "That's exactly why I need to talk to you. Because you're the first person in years who's treated me like a human being, not a walking bank account." His voice cracked slightly. Betraying vulnerability, he usually hid behind walls of arrogance. Emily's guard stayed up. She had seen men like him before, powerful and polished, using charm to cover their flaws. Yet something in his tone made her pause. She studied him, remembering the man who had wanted to give up, the man she dragged through the flood with her bare hands. He looked smaller now, not in stature but in spirit, like someone searching for something he couldn't buy. Against her better judgment, she said softly, "Fine, talk." Richard smiled faintly, relief crossing his features. He told her about the foundation he wanted to create in honor of his late wife, aimed at helping single mothers and struggling families rebuild after disasters. I want you to be a part of it, he said, his eyes locking on hers. Emily blinked, stunned. Me? I'm just a maid. Richard shook his head. No, you're the woman who gave me a reason to live again. That makes you more qualified than anyone else. Emily thought she had heard everything. But what Richard offered her next would change her and Tyler's future forever. Emily stared at Richard as if he had spoken a foreign language. Me? Run something like that? Her voice trembled with disbelief. I clean floors, I cook meals, I make beds. I don't run foundations. Richard leaned forward, his gaze steady. You run your life, don't you? You raise your son on your own. You survive with almost nothing. If anyone knows what these families need, it's you. The foundation isn't about money, it's about heart. And you've got more of that than anyone I've ever met. She wanted to believe him, but the doubts clawed at her. Emily pictured Tyler, sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework under a flickering light bulb, waiting for her to get home late at night. What if this was all a trick? What if he was just another rich man throwing around promises? Why me? She asked again, her eyes narrowing. Richard's answer was simple. Because you didn't let me die when I begged you to. You saw something worth saving even when I didn't. That kind of strength is what I need by my side. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the Johnsons' air conditioner. Emily's hands tightened around the mop handle, her heart racing. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but another part, a small, daring part, wanted to hope. If I say yes, what happens to my son? She asked softly. Richard didn't hesitate. He comes with you, always. He's the reason you fight so hard, right? Then he's part of this too. Emily's throat tightened as tears threatened to spill. No one had ever said words like that to her before. Later that evening, Emily sat on the edge of her worn sofa, Tyler asleep with his head on her lap. She replayed Richard's offer over and over, trying to make sense of it. Her phone buzzed with a text. Think about it. I'll be waiting for your answer. Ah? She looked at her son's peaceful face, remembering the flood, the fear, the moment when she almost lost everything. Could this really be the chance she'd prayed for on nights when she cried herself to sleep? The next morning, Emily walked to the bus stop, her mind swirling with questions. She felt the weight of her old life pressing against the possibility of a new one. And deep down, she knew one thing for sure. If she said yes, nothing would ever be the same again. But Emily had no idea that her decision wouldn't just change her future. It would put her right in the middle of a storm, far greater than any flood. 2 days later, Emily found herself standing in the grand lobby of one of Richard's Houston hotels. She wore her best clothes, though they were simple, freshly ironed, and a little faded. Her hands trembled as she clutched her small purse. She almost turned back, but the thought of Tyler pushed her forward. When the elevator doors opened and Richard stepped out in another perfectly tailored suit, she nearly forgot how to breathe. "Emily," he said warmly, "I wasn't sure you'd come." She swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the foundation, about my son. And I realized something. I can't teach Tyler to be brave if I'm too scared to take chances myself." Richard's expression softened, pride flickering in his eyes. "So, is that a yes?" Emily's heart raced as she nodded. "Yes, I'll do it." The relief that washed over Richard was almost visible, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years, finally exhaling. "You won't regret this," he promised. But Emily quickly raised a hand. "No, don't promise me that. Just don't make me regret believing in you." For a man who had spent his life hearing yes men and empty flattery, her blunt honesty struck him like a lightning bolt. In that moment, he knew she wasn't just another person in his orbit. She was going to be the one who held him accountable. As they shook hands, cameras flashed from the far side of the lobby. A journalist had caught sight of them together, and in seconds the whispers spread. "The Maid is working with the Millionaire now?" Emily stiffened, panic rising, but Richard leaned closer and whispered, "Let them talk. We know the truth." Still, Emily couldn't shake the fear. What if people turned on her? What if this was more than she could handle? The world was about to watch her every move. And then came the moment that neither of them expected, an emergency call from the mayor's office. The city wanted Richard's new foundation to help coordinate relief for the next hurricane season, and they insisted Emily be part of the announcement. Emily froze. She was just a maid a few weeks ago. Now the weight of an entire city was about to rest on her shoulders. If you were Emily, standing there in front of flashing cameras and the eyes of the entire city, would you take that risk? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The press conference was held in the heart of Houston, inside a towering civic center where chandeliers sparkled above rows of eager reporters. Emily stood nervously backstage, smoothing down her modest blouse, her palms damp with sweat. Richard stood beside her, calm and collected, though even he glanced at her with a hint of concern. "Just speak from your heart," he whispered. "That's all you need to do." Emily nodded, though her knees trembled so badly she thought they might give out. When her name was called, the crowd shifted, cameras flashing like 1,000 stars. Emily stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges tightly, her reflection staring back at her from the glass teleprompter she didn't know how to use. For a moment her throat locked. Whispers ran through the room. "That's the Maid! She doesn't look like a director." The words stung, but then she pictured Tyler, smiling at her from their tiny apartment, believing she was a hero. That memory lit a fire inside her. Her voice broke the silence, steady and warm. "I'm not here because I'm powerful. I'm not here because I'm rich. I'm here because, in the middle of a storm, I saw a man drowning and I couldn't walk away." The room went silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause. She continued, stronger now. "There are thousands of families out there who feel like they're drowning every single day. Families like mine, families like yours. This foundation isn't just Richard Anderson's vision, it's ours. And together we can make sure no one feels forgotten again." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Richard, standing just behind her, was stunned. He had expected her to stumble, maybe mutter a few words of gratitude. But instead, she spoke with a conviction and raw honesty that no PR team could ever script. For the first time in years, Richard felt genuine pride. Not in himself, but in someone else. Emily had taken the spotlight and turned it into a beacon of hope. Afterward, as they stepped off the stage, Richard leaned close and whispered, "You just changed everything." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "No," she said softly, "we did." But deep down, she knew her life had just crossed a line she could never step back from. The maid who once went unnoticed in marble halls had become a voice that people were ready to follow. But the higher Emily rose, the more enemies began to watch her every move. And one of them was closer than she ever imagined. Not everyone was cheering for Emily's sudden rise. Within days of the press conference, gossip columns and online forums buzzed with speculation. Some called her a symbol of hope, but others dismissed her as just a maid pretending to be important. Anonymous posts questioned her background, asking why a billionaire would trust someone with no college degree to lead a foundation. The whispers turned into headlines, hero or hustler. Who really is Emily Carter? At the Anderson headquarters, board members weren't thrilled either. Men in crisp suits sat around a long mahogany table, murmuring their doubts. "She has no experience," one scoffed. "This is charity, not a fairy tale," said another. Richard silenced them with a glare, his voice firm. "She saved my life when I had given up on it. That's experience you can't teach." But he knew convincing the world would not be easy. He also knew Emily would soon discover how brutal the public eye could be. Emily, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting. Her phone buzzed constantly with reporters seeking interviews, neighbors suddenly acting overly friendly, and strangers asking for money she didn't have. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the wrong choice. Tyler noticed her worry, climbing into bed beside her. "Mom," he whispered, "you always told me to be brave. So be brave now." His words wrapped around her like armor. For him, she had to keep fighting. Still, the attacks became personal. A local news anchor sneered on live television. "Are we really supposed to believe a maid can handle multi-million-dollar projects? Isn't this just a publicity stunt?" Emily's cheeks burned as she watched, shame and anger twisting inside her. But the next day, when she walked into the foundation's office, set up inside one of Richard's hotels, she lifted her chin high. She refused to let strangers define her. She was more than a uniform. She was more than a headline. Richard watched her carefully that morning, seeing the storm in her eyes. "They'll try to tear you down," he warned quietly. "But you've already proven you can fight through worse. Remember that flood? You didn't let it take me. Don't let them take you now." Emily took a deep breath and nodded. "Then let's give them something they'll never forget." But Emily had no idea that the greatest betrayal wouldn't come from strangers or reporters. It would come from someone inside Richard's own circle. Among Richard's trusted circle was Charles Whitmore, his longtime business partner, and the man who had helped him expand the hotel empire over the last 20 years. Charles was polished, silver-haired, and ruthless, a man who believed every decision should be measured by profit margins. He had never trusted Emily from the beginning, and as the foundation gained attention, his resentment only grew. "She's a liability," he muttered to the board. "And if Richard can't see that, then maybe someone needs to open his eyes." One afternoon, Emily walked into the foundation's office to find Charles waiting for her. He offered a cold smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Emily Carter," he said smoothly. The maid turned miracle worker. Quite the fairy tale. Emily stiffened, her instincts on edge. "I'm just here to do my job," she replied evenly. Charles leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Jobs have qualifications. You have none. And sooner or later the world will see that." His words dripped with venom, a warning she couldn't ignore. Emily tried to shake it off, but strange things began happening. Important documents disappeared from her desk. Financial reports went missing, and rumors spread that she was mishandling donations. Reporters suddenly showed up with questions she had no answers for. She confronted Richard, her voice breaking. "Someone's trying to make me look like a fraud." Richard's jaw tightened, suspicion flashing in his eyes. He knew who it was, but confronting Charles directly would mean war. Meanwhile, Emily poured herself into the work, traveling to small towns devastated by floods and hurricanes, listening to families' stories and making sure aid reached them directly. Cameras followed, and her authenticity silenced many critics. But Charles wasn't done. He fed the media damaging lies, that Emily was taking money for herself, that she was using Richard to climb out of poverty. "She'll drag you down with her," he told Richard privately. "Mark my words." One evening, as Emily locked up the office, she overheard Charles on the phone, his words sharp as knives. "She's not going to last. By the time I'm finished, Richard will see she's nothing but a maid playing dress-up." Emily froze in the hallway, her stomach turning cold. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about rumors or sabotage, it was war. But when Emily decided to fight back, she discovered an ally she never expected, someone who knew Charles's darkest secret. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped out of the shadowed hallway, the echo of Charles's cruel words still burning in her ears. She wanted to confront him right there, to scream that she wasn't afraid. But something held her back, instinct. Instead, she slipped quietly into the night, determined to find another way. She couldn't risk losing everything she had built. Tyler's future depended on it. The next day, while sorting through boxes of donated supplies at the Foundation's warehouse, Emily noticed one of the longtime hotel employees watching her closely. His name was Daniel Hayes, a middle-aged accountant who had been with Richard's company for over 15 years. He was quiet, often overlooked, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "You shouldn't let Whitmore get under your skin," Daniel muttered suddenly, catching her off guard. Emily blinked. "How do you know about that?" Daniel set down the clipboard he was holding and leaned closer. "Because I've seen him do this before. Charles has been manipulating numbers for years, hiding money in places no one would dare to look. If Richard knew the full story, he'd cut him off in a second." Emily's breath caught. "You're saying Charles is stealing?" Daniel nodded grimly. "Not just stealing. Laundering, covering debts, feeding investors lies. He's built an empire on Richard's back, and now he's afraid you'll expose him just by being here." Emily's head spun. It all made sense. The missing documents, the media attacks, the whispers that never seemed to stop. Charles wasn't just trying to ruin her reputation. He was trying to protect himself. For the first time, Emily felt the tides shift. She wasn't powerless. She had leverage. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked carefully. Daniel's answer was simple. "Because I'm tired of watching him destroy good people. And because you saved the one man who still has the power to stop him." That night, Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the folder Daniel had slipped into her hands. Inside were pages of financial statements, transfers, and hidden accounts, all evidence that could expose Charles once and for all. Her hands trembled as she traced the numbers, realizing the weight of what she held. For the first time since the flood, Emily wasn't just reacting to the storm. She was about to start one of her own. But when Emily finally showed Richard the truth, his reaction wasn't what she expected. And it would put everything she had built on the line. Emily didn't sleep that night. The folder sat on her kitchen table like a ticking bomb, its contents too heavy to ignore. By morning, she had made her decision. She dressed carefully, pulling her hair back neatly, and clutched the folder to her chest as if it were both a shield and a weapon. Tyler hugged her tightly before she left. "Be brave, Mom," he whispered. She kissed his forehead and promised she would. But deep inside, she feared she might be walking straight into disaster. At Richard's downtown office, the air was cool and perfumed with money, leather chairs, glass walls, and the faint scent of cigars. Richard looked up as Emily entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Emily, you look like you've seen a ghost." She set the folder on his desk with trembling hands. "No," she said firmly, "but you're about to." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity mixing with concern, and began flipping through the documents. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a stormy silence.